Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Daily Objective. And today we're going to be discussing more of what is on everybody's mind recently, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia's president and his army. And we're going to be talking about specifically the economic implications of this. I know many places you go where it might be considered rude to even bring this up. Like, what do you care about the economy right now? We're talking about human life. But I think hopefully in this sort of environment around a lot of you and a lot of us here on the show, we understand that economics is not an abstraction merely. It is an actual matter of life and death. It's people putting food on the table, etc. So we'll get into that as well. But let's remind you real quick, we're coming to London March 28th, and that week leading up to Ayn Rand Con, the Daily Objective and other ARCUK shows will be live in London. So make sure you're in London, and for any information, hit us up on the ARCUK website linked below. And it's March 28th through April 4th is when you want to be around. Trust me on that. All right, now let's get down to business and meet two guests today. We've got, I believe, former head of the Ayn Rand Institute, Jim Brown.
CEO. I wouldn't say the CEO is the head, but yeah. And I'm still on the board, of course, right?
Yes, for a current board member, and just overall, I've referred to you in my mind as like the muscle of the movement, right? You're in great shape. You seem very athletic, and maybe we could have us get some fitness tips here before we're done. Then we've got someone who I've
You're too much, Rucka.
Thank you. And we've got a returning guest. So both of today's guests have shows and have had shows on this network relating to finance. And Seth has been here before. I have paid him the greatest compliment in the past. I said he kind of looks like me. Seth, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Seth, man. Levine. It's true, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I guess, Seth, why don't you get us started? Like your overall view of how the invasion of Ukraine by Russia is going to affect the economy here in America or in the world?
Sure. So what I thought I'd do, because I'm looking at this pretty closely. There's, I think, a lot of directions where this can go. So I'll share a U.S. markets perspective. Sorry, to our overseas friends, but I think that sort of will also kind of cover a lot of it as well. So I thought I'd just kind of like run through some slides of various markets, that I pulled this morning. So, the data is probably from Friday. Keep that in mind. You have using Koifin as a source, and just kind of, see if the pictures will kind of tell a story. And then I'll give you my views of at least what I think are the main issues going forward.
Sounds good.
Yeah. So I guess, because the world in which we live in, I should probably just throw up a disclaimer that, this is, viewers of the Integrated Investor Show will recognize this. These are just personal opinions, not investment advice, or, solicitations to buy or sell anything. You guys just kind of do your own work on all this. So I pulled that down, but I should probably leave the screen back up. So I'm just going to run through some markets. So, probably the thing that caught everyone's eyes first. This is the exchange rate of the Russian ruble versus the U.S. dollar. Now it's inverted. So up means that the dollar is appreciating in value and the ruble is losing value. As you can see, the ruble has lost the inverse of that, called 65% of its value. Since the beginning of this crisis, just a week ago or so. So the Russian, people are fleeing Russian currencies. Let's see. Next, if we look at kind of the Russian stock market, this is just an ETF that I pulled up, the VanEck ETF for Russia. We can see the Russian stocks have gotten crushed as well. Those are down 60%. Right, so this is a pretty broad market impact on the Russian financial sector. As a corollary, Russia, their economy is a big resource economy. So we've actually seen commodities spike up in price. The notable one is oil. So oil is the blue line on here. CL1, which is just a WTI price. There's a million of them but oil has is now up over $100 a barrel. I mean, we haven't seen levels this this high in a really long time, probably since 2014 or so. And also wheat, just because Ukraine is a big wheat sector. Wheat has been extremely volatile, kind of moving around, kind of volatility, levels that I've never seen. Not that I'm a big wheat guy, but it's just indicative of
You're
what's
not
going
a
on.
wheat guy.
Not a wheat guy. Yeah.
Wow. And we invited you on here for what exactly? I'm kidding.
Yeah. Who knows, right? I mean, not a Wheaties. There you go.
Well, maybe Jim Brown knows about the benefits
Absolutely.
of Wheaties.
Wheat germ, wheatgrass. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Good for men. Yes.
Yeah. But here are some things that I'm pretty familiar with is what's going on in some of the safe haven assets, right? So the blue line there is gold. Gold has been on an absolute, tear really all year. But also, more recently, it's picked up again. It's kind of flirting with $2,000 an ounce. We see the U.S. 10-year yield is down. That means people are buying bonds, raising their prices and lowering their yields. And you could see very recently, what had been, the market had been expecting, rates to rise this year. They are now retracting that in a kind of flight to safety. And also what's really interesting, it's very hard to see, is Bitcoin here, this purple bar. Bitcoin initially, sold off really hard at the beginning of it. I think that's due to a lot of leverage speculation that takes place in that kind of region of the world. But it's actually kind of recovered pretty recently, which I think is pretty interesting. Also, I think we're seeing a bit of what I call kind of a flight to quality, kind of investors fleeing into U.S. assets. If you look at the purple line here, this is the dollar index. So this is a dollar versus a basket of currencies, and we see, the dollar is appreciating. The U.S. dollar is appreciating versus other currencies, and that's most notably against the euro. It's probably the biggest, but also, all the major currencies are in there. And the SPY, right? This is the U.S. stock market index. Came down hard initially at the beginning, but it's starting to recover again. And flows have been pretty positive. So just kind of wondering if investors are coming into the U.S. as kind of a safe haven trade. And and lastly here, this is the U.S. bond market. That's kind of near and dear to my heart. I have two ETFs up here. The LQD is the iShares investment grade index, and the HYG, the purple, is the iShares high yield index or junk bond index. And what's been pretty interesting there is we've seen those actually rally again into this, where you would think, particularly high yield, where you're seeing stress, stresses, geopolitical stresses, that you would think that part of that asset class would be hit hard, but it's not. And again, it could be, kind of theorizing, maybe some flight to quality into U.S. assets.
Okay, so there's a lot happening there. Yes,
a lot there. Yeah. So as I sort of synthesize and those are just a select few that I was able to pull up real quickly this morning, and kind of my takeaways from all these charts are some obvious ones, which are Russian asset markets are getting hit extremely hard, as you would expect, as kind of the world is, kind of pulling away from Russia. Maybe Jim could speak a little bit more on that. We're also seeing kind of the U.S. markets less affected than this. And I think that is maybe surprising some people. And I think maybe that's perhaps this flight to quality, into U.S. dollar assets phenomenon. And another interesting kind of observation is that commodity prices are increasing and creating a pretty interesting interest rate dilemma, in my view, because higher commodity costs leads to higher inflation, the way how we talk about inflation today, and higher inflation usually requires higher interest rates. However, a corollary of what's going on, or not corollary is the wrong word, but another kind of view of what's going on kind of in current events is, war could be higher financial stress. And higher financial stress usually means lower interest rates. But lower interest rates and high inflation at the same time, well, that can create stagflation. And that is some kind of, that is starting to build a little bit of a market narrative that I'm seeing. So when I look at kind of what's going on in markets, like I have four sort of main four main topics that are kind of kicking around my head. The first is, all eyes are on kind of the Fed and the interest rates hikes that are kind of expected for this year. The markets are expecting the Fed to raise rates 25 basis points in March, and again in May and June, just going by market probabilities based on futures. And, as I wrote about pretty recently, and this is my February article, I see market volatility and interest rates tied together very intimately. So I'm keeping an eye on how this interest rate volatility could maybe lead through into other markets. So that's number one. The second thing I'm kind of looking at is maybe obvious to everyone is a global war, like a World War III kind of scenario. I mean, that certainly is not looked priced in, at least into U.S. asset markets. The third thing I'm looking at is China's reaction. I think this may be one of the most interesting, investment market themes to look at. I wrote about this in October, and I had two shows on it in early November. How I saw China was moving away from the West and Western values, and in my view, that was a pretty big negative. Well, maybe China's been a little bit silent, surprisingly silent on the topic of Ukraine. They are threatening Taiwan. Does maybe China see what's going on with Russia, see the world's reaction, and decide, what? Maybe we want to step back from this imperialistic kind of centralized view, authoritarian view, and maybe rejoin the rest of the world. So we join the Western world, and if so, I think that could be a real positive for it. And just lastly, number four is again sort of will U.S. markets benefit from a flight to safety? We're seeing assets come out of prices down in emerging markets. We're seeing prices down in things like U.S. tech, which is kind of interesting, and just how that dynamic plays out over time. So that was a mouthful. I'll leave it all there.
All right. Well, Jim, any thoughts occur to you watching that and listening?
That was pretty. That was really wide ranging and comprehensive. I mean, there's a lot of places to dive in there. So maybe maybe what would be possibly interesting is to dive in just on one aspect of what you mentioned, Seth. Maybe at the China angle and what may be happening financially between Russia and China that could potentially affect, the whole world and the world order of trade and so forth. And to talk about that, I guess, Seth and Rucka, have you heard on the news about people talking about sanctioning Russia with the SWIFT system? Have you heard that?
A little bit.
Okay, yeah. So the way it's been presented is that this is a money moving mechanism agreed to by banks in different countries, and that it's possible to intervene and prevent Vladimir Putin from moving money among banks, and therefore to shut down his economy or really seriously impair his economy and thereby prevent him from prosecuting the war. And just in preview, I thought I might explain that SWIFT system just a little bit, enough so that in preview, I want to say, I don't think that's true. Because for one thing, he's had a long time to prepare for this. He's not stupid, and he knows that money is his lifeline, like it is for anyone. So the idea that he is going to blunder into Kiev, and then Boris Johnson is going to say, "Oh, we've got to shut down the SWIFT system." And I heard Amy Klobuchar, U.S. Senator, yesterday saying, "Oh yes, SWIFT system going to cripple the Russians and so forth." No, it's not that cut and dry. So the SWIFT system is, I'm going to tell you what it is and what it's not. It stands for the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications. There's like 10 or 11 or 12,000 banks involved in over 200 countries. It is actually a private organization, a cooperative society founded under Belgian law in 1979. And it's not a money moving system. It is just a messaging system. It's a system that sends messages from one bank to another or to third-party banks. And all it does is it's got protocols, systems, standards that the banks have all agreed on to make it easy for them to transfer money from one to the other. So if two banks have a correspondent account and customers of those banks want to pay each other, then you don't really need the SWIFT system. They just have an agreement and they exchange money for their customers. But let's suppose a guy in Norway wants to buy Cuban cigars from a guy in Berlin. And it's a perfectly legal transaction, those two, but their banks don't have any agreement. They can't deal with each other, and there's currencies involved, different currencies. So they go through another bank that they do have an agreement with. Both of them have separate agreements. Let's say that's Chase Manhattan Bank. And they actually clear the trade. It's the same process of transferring money, except there's another party involved, another layer involved. And now suppose further that the U.S. has an embargo on Cuban cigars, which it does. And the traffic comes over the system and everyone's ready to change money, but then U.S. regulators are looking in and they say, oh yeah, Cuban cigars, on this. No, you can't have your Cuban cigars, even though it's legal between Norway and Germany. You cannot route this money this way. And the reason I picked that example is it actually happened about 10 years ago. It was a big court case. And guess what? The Norwegian guy trying to buy his cigars never got him. And he lost his money. It ended up in a black hole at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security or something. What I just described is an example of the U.S. government increasingly inserting itself into transactions since 9/11, since the Patriot Act and so forth. And it's become quite common. And you might remember that we have already been here with Ukraine in 2014. There were sanctions being considered against Putin when he invaded Crimea back in 2014. To my knowledge, they were not cut out of the SWIFT system. But since then, actually starting before that and since then, a whole variety of other payment systems have sprung up. There's one in Europe that handles almost all credit card transactions among all the Euro countries, never goes through SWIFT. China has its own. It's called China Interbank Payments, CIPS or something.
Yeah.
That they operate with all kinds of different correspondents. There's an emerging markets development bank. It's a BRICS development bank that was put together in 2014 or 15, I think, by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and some African countries. They all have correspondent relationships among their banks, among the national banks. It's a similar kind of an agreement system. In addition, China can operate independently with Iran, with Cuba, with Venezuela, with North Korea. I would say there's a million ways around the SWIFT system. Now, Russia's main problem is to sell oil. They're a big exporter of oil. Guess who's the world's biggest importer of oil? China. Why do you need dollars and a US bank to settle those transactions? And further, I would say once oil gets out there in the system, once it's sold, it's so fungible. It's as fungible almost as water. It's once it's on a tanker, those things get redirected to different ports and different refineries all over the world. It's very tradable and fungible. And while it might be possible to identify this oil from Russia and say, oh yeah, we're not going to let that hit a U.S. port, that would really disrupt oil markets. That way more than what's happening now. That would be a very big problem. Energy is it's the lifeblood of everything. So my view is that what you're getting on this, a couple of just little thoughts here, and I'll be quiet. What you're getting on this information about SWIFT is I have sort of two observations. One, it's, I think, partly at least showboating and propaganda. Yeah, I think this is going to hurt Russia, but is not going to, I don't think it's going to stop him for a day. You need something more effective than that. And second, I put it together with something else I saw recently, which was the willingness of Canada to shut down the accounts of the truckers. Increasingly, governments are intervening and inserting themselves into what, just a few years ago would be considered completely legitimate transactions. So this is a tendency by banking authorities to do this. And I think this is showcasing a very big financial development, which is the Ukraine. I'm saying Ukraine and the SWIFT discussion is showcasing a big development in markets, in banking, which is for governments to insert themselves into private transactions and control the flow of money in ways that they have not done before. One of the big implications I see.
Interesting. So this could actually be unrelated to Russia per se. This could be a serious precedent setter for governments regulating and meddling in people's financial or other business dealings in a way that will be used to regulate and generally disrupt economic activity in the future.
Yeah, and ironically, I think the Chinese and the Russians were onto this long before. I think they've been onto this for years. They've been preparing themselves. So they got these alternative payment systems, these alternative like multilateral agreements, trade agreements that they can use to get around. And ironically now, I'm not trying to change the subject, but I do think that governments like Canadian government, UK government, US government are now turning their banking powers inward onto their own populations. Because we're the ones who are more vulnerable now than, say, the Russians are. So to me, it's not, in other words, the Ukraine invasion is not causing this, but it's showcasing a tendency and laying bare a tendency, I think, that it was already underway. I'll just put it that way.
Well, Seth, you're nodding your head. Do you tend to see it the same way?
Yeah, I agree with that. Jim did a fantastic job at illustrating the other payment systems out there. In fact, cryptocurrency, a big part of it is a backlash, and this is the positive part of cryptocurrency, in my view. It's a backlash of the government, already inserted into the payment system.
Yeah.
Again, if you look at sort of the original Bitcoin white paper, it calls Bitcoin an electronic cash payment system. Everything else that people ascribe to Bitcoin literally are just abstractions. So, this is Jim's spot on here, and I think he's right in that. These, the crisis of all, it's like the Warren Buffett quote, in a sense. When the tide goes out, you see who's wearing a bathing suit. These crises showcase, and illustrate kind of parts of financial markets that we haven't necessarily seen before, but now they're right out there in the open, kind of for everyone to see.
Okay, a couple of super chats. Marilyn, thank you. Ashley, thank you. Marilyn asks, does U.S. energy policy help Putin? Either one of you want to answer? Go ahead.
Seth, go ahead. I know exactly how I'm going to answer, and I'm going to bet you're not much different. Yes, it absolutely helps Putin. there's just in both direct ways and indirect ways. I mean, directly, it raises the cost of oil to U.S. citizens and allows us to be vulnerable to Putin's actions, which raises the direct cost of gasoline at the pump. And then indirectly, by not being in a position to export our energy, particularly develop pipelines, which then can be developed into the LNG and liquid natural gas export that could help alleviate the problems in Europe. They become more dependent on Russia, as you know, with the 2 Nord Stream pipelines. And then, so they are now much less willing to, it stands to reason they would be incentivized not to stand up to Russia in ways. In fact, I would even say that it might be the combination of energy policy and other perceived weaknesses that made Putin think, if not now, when? If I'm going to strike, there's no better time than now.
Yeah, I think also too,
that's my take. Yeah. What do you think?
I mean, even just tying it back to the SWIFT system and the financial system, the U.S. dollar is the is the reserve currency, right? That means something. I mean, you could argue whether it's the dollar or the euro dollar, and I'm not going to get into that. That's complicated, but ultimately it all comes back to U.S. dollars. At sort of the lubrication of the world economy, and oil, all commodity contracts are settled in US dollars. So, the higher that oil goes, the more US dollars, forget money, the more US dollars Russia gets its hands on. And again, the less it needs to use the SWIFT system, right? So, or even the banking system in general. So, in a sense, like it undermine, not only does it undermine, it also undermines the sanctions as well, from their intended consequence, which is, just ironic, I suppose.
Now, go ahead.
I'm just going to remark further evidence that the Russians and Chinese have been, to Seth's point, trying to get away from the dollar and dependence on the dollar. They've sold down much of their foreign reserves. They have sold down their treasury very quietly, sold down their treasury holdings tremendously in the last, 5 years or so. They're down to very low amounts. People used to worry, oh, you're going to hold us hostage. Well, they sold them down. They don't really feel they need them anymore. Those 2 central banks are the 2 largest buyers of gold in the world, the Russian central bank and the Chinese central bank. And they have other ways of settling their transactions and doing business. That sort of network I mentioned before, it's like everybody but the UK, Europe, and the USA, it's like they can do business all over through one method or another. And we can't sanction the world. I would also say every time we use the dollar as a club like this, it gets a little less valuable. I mean, it's kind of a wasting asset, right?
Yeah. It incentivizes everyone to move away from.
Exactly.
From the system.
It does exactly what I was discussing. It incentivizes them to move away from the SWIFT system, move away from dollar settlements, move away from using dollar-based banks.
How long has Russia been an exporter of oil? Has this been the case for 100 years, or is it more recent, or what? If you know.
I do know that it's been mostly since their oil industry developed in a semi-private way. That is since the early 90s. That's since it's really grown. You have Lukoil, Rosneft, Gazprom, the big Russian oil. They're the heavy shareholders. The government is heavy shareholders in all cases, and they're sort of semi-private. But no, it's grown, and they've had investments from, say, British Petroleum, which is just now because of this selling their stake in Rosneft, I think. But no, they've had big investments from private investors all over the world, and they export huge amounts of oil. I think second only to Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, it's not just oil; it's other commodities too. Big in steel, so like the rise in steel, as opposed to from this, is going to have a big big impact, or potentially could have a big impact for like the automotive industry. Even though, Russian, there's very little auto production that takes place in Russia, and there's very little sales into the Russian economy, but it's kind of that network, that global network of steel is pretty big. Natural gas is kind of big too. I mean, if you take a step back, it's really no surprise, right? The more authoritative, the more free an economy, the more you would expect intellectual work to dominate. And the more authoritative an economy, the more sort of, perceptual the work. And that's not a knock on one versus the other, but obviously we know that, we could employ the objectivist epistemology here, where we know a free mind is free to form more concepts, so it's able to abstract more, and when you can abstract more, you could do higher value work, with less resources, right? Because you're using your mind as the resource. So it's no surprise that Russia, and again, this is not a knock on Russian people. This is a political statement in a way, or a commentary of a political statement, that because it's more authoritarian, it has a higher degree of resource. It's a more resource dependent economy.
Yeah, the impression I get is that as horrible as communism is on the world stage, fascism is scarier. That's the impression I get, because like you look at communist China or the Soviet Union, they didn't have very much leverage economically in the world. It's from what I gather. But whereas this sort of weird, creepy hybrid of private business with an authoritarian government that we see in both China and Russia, we see them having a lot of other countries by the balls, if I understand correctly.
Well, I think I agree that they've kind of got us by the gonads, but it's our own fault. Our environmentalist policies have and restrictions and so forth on the energy industry. I mean, we just had in only a few years, with the invention of fracking, to your point, Seth, a brilliant invention, a brilliant combination of technologies that could probably only occur in the USA with a combination of innovation and property rights. The US became a net producer, net exporter in just a few years, like 10 or 15 years. It didn't take long for such a big, heavy, capital intensive industry. And just in a few years, or just in less than a year, through the shutdown of ANWR and some leasing and pipeline, that's all reversed. So it wouldn't take much to reverse the policy to let American industry be energy dominant again. And that's so. I don't put it in the. By the way, I don't put it in terms of U.S. should be energy dominant. No, U.S. firms, by their natural competitive advantage and by their tremendous innovation, they become energy dominant. And that could easily happen again. I tend to think it will happen sooner or later. Sooner or later, the light bulb will go off in Washington. But
I have a little bit more of a benevolent view than you, Jim, and this is not to pick on you. Like I don't think China. I think like the past couple of years have just shown how, even though the U.S. is far less free than we've ever been before, still shows how much power there is in freedom versus kind of the authoritarian kind of bent. Like China and COVID is like really a disaster. It's really a mess. Russia. I mean, how this war is starting in Ukraine, like it's kind of a mess. That's not to say it can't turn, the war can't turn its tide, or anything can't turn its tide, but I think it's just showing the weakness of authoritarianism actually in practice versus how we, versus kind of the romanticism of it, for lack of a better word. And when the free, and freedom is still much more powerful, even though we're less free than we've been before. We are still freer than these other regimes. And I think times like these show it, just show how how big that gap actually is.
Yeah. I mean, everything America needs, or England, we sort of have. We need to turn to capitalism, deregulate, and so on. We need liberty, and that'll give us a hell of a lot more independence and strength and confidence in dealing with the rest of the world. So Yeah, that's definitely worth mentioning. Could both of you kind of give sort of a man in the street like indication of what people could expect if you were to explain to someone like how what's happening in Ukraine might affect people's everyday life or general economic life in looking ahead?
I'll just pick one thing. What may happen? Yeah, and it's a good way to put the question. So a lot of people are interested in the stock market for a lot of reasons, because they're in it, because they want to get in it, or because its level affects something else that they do or own, or general prosperity or whatever. So my belief is that the stock market has traded for the last, say, 12 years, mostly on Fed liquidity, providing liquidity. Every time the stock market has hiccuped in the last 12 years, the Federal Reserve has ridden to the rescue with more liquidity, more quantitative easing, which I have described in great detail in my newsletter. And so the question now is, the Fed has, with consumer inflation rising, the Fed has said, "Oh, we've got to stop doing that. Looks like we're causing inflation. We have to rein it in. To do that, we have to reduce aggregate demand. The way to do that is to let interest rates rise, and the way to do that is to stop buying so many bonds. So they have to raise short-term rates through their open market operations instead of the Fed funds rate, and they have to stop soaking up so much federal debt." Now, that raises when they start talking about that, you see the stock market start to shake, because the big flood of liquidity that's been feeding stock prices looks like it might be drying up. So that's, in my view, why, I think it's pretty clear why the stock market recently has been teetering. You've seen all but the biggest stocks kind of fall. I think the average stock on the S&P 500, the average stock is probably down 20% or more. But some of the big stocks are still holding it up. But so now Ukraine comes along. There's plans to raise interest rates, and now Putin comes along and disrupts the world. This causes, when payments aren't made, and SWIFT can contribute to the SWIFT restrictions can contribute to this. It's the same kind of thing that happened to Lehman. When banks and institutions become illiquid, people panic and they sell their assets to get cash, and prices tend to collapse. Follow me now. So then what the Fed has to do is they have to react with more liquidity to keep that from happening. So what you could get here is you could get a bad news is good news situation. You could get the liquidity squeeze caused by the payments problems caused by the war, causes the Fed to react in the way of pumping liquidity back into the system and trying to pump up stock prices again, and perhaps delay. So I'm just saying, don't try to play this. This is a dangerous game for people to play. But when you see the market moving up and down like this, or if you see the market move up sharply on what looks like terrible news, people dying in Kiev. Boy, back on the sidelines, the Fed is, opening its repo facilities and pumping QE and doing things like never before. And that can be a big boost to investment markets that's hard to see. It's not on the news. So that's the kind of stuff that goes on that with the Fed that you maybe want to be a little attuned to.
Yeah. I would say, kind of my view, average person on the street, the big thing that's gonna be felt by everyone is just going to be rising consumer prices because of input costs. Oil, it's going to be expensive to fill your tank of gas. It's going to be expensive to fill your tank up. It's going to be, goods and services are going to be expensive because of, higher commodity costs, but also transportation costs are going up too. So, if you can't fly, fly over Russia because of no-fly zones, if you're shipping things from like Europe to Asia, that gets more expensive. So you're going to see things like, and if even if, so that is going to make kind of your just costs in general go up. And then,
don't you think that was probably, don't you think that was probably in the cards with or without Ukraine, but that maybe Ukraine just makes it a little worse, right?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. This is adding to already, pretty bad supply chain situation out there that I blame on COVID, predominantly, and I should say the government's response to COVID.
Sure.
But then there's also things like, okay, well, if there could be there's a potential for stresses in the European banking system because because of the SWIFT system, it's going to be more difficult for Russian banks to move money around. It's not impossible, as Jim kind of highlighted, but it's just more difficult. And the financial system is leveraged, right? There's it's just how it all works. It works kind of on debt and borrowed money. So small changes can have big impacts. So you could see, stresses in European banks who have lent a lot of money to Russian banks, for example. I think it's mainly I think most of that gets done in Europe and less so to the US. I think for people
I agree,
watching,
Seth, I'm hearing stories about European banks having to raise capital. So I think you're correct there. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think also how it plays out in the market, I think are just going to be complicated. A lot of things that Jim said, I think hold true. Also, just looking through some of those slides, like there's just some weird stuff going on. The interconnection of the financial markets is very complex. So anyone looking, I think anyone looking for markets with firm answers, they're going to be disappointed. I think we're going to see some really screwy market moves that could be interesting.
So many problems in the world, and the answer is selfishness.
There's only three of us, right?
Yeah, right. But who would have thought selling people on selfishness would be such hard work? But hey, philosophy is serious business. So let's read Ayn Rand, everybody. All right, a few more super chats. Marilyn asks if SWIFT stands for Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Transactions. Is that right?
It stands for Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Transactions, telecommunications.
Telecommunications. Yeah. So
it's old.
We will refund that, Marilyn.
Yeah, it is an old system.
It's like
telecommunications.
It's 45 years old. It's yeah. It replaced an old system called telex, and none of you are old enough to remember telex. I am, so it's been updated, but it's antiquated.
I assume Taylor Swift was getting dragged into this conflict, so that's what I associated.
She would definitely improve it. That's for sure.
Absolutely. Maybe that's the answer. I know David Hasselhoff singing by the Berlin Wall meant a lot to them over there back in the late 80s or early 90s, I guess it was, when the wall came down. Anyway, back to the super chats. Jonathan Honig with $9.99. Thank you. Mary Aline with $5. What's that?
I said, thank you, Jonathan.
Yes, Jonathan, thank you. Guy gets you on the show one of these days, Jonathan.
Stand up guy.
Yes. Marilyn with $5 says individual human lives mean very little to the governments in either China or Russia. And I'm afraid we're not far behind here in the rest of the world, but it's not too late. All right, free trade with 9 of the Swedish currencies. Thank you for that. All right, everybody, coming up today at 7 p.m. UK time, it's a book club discussion for members only. It's the book K by Calumet, which I think is Ayn Rand's favorite book.
Calumet K.
K. Oh, is the name of the book Calumet K?
Correct.
Oh, okay. I thought maybe the author was Calumet and the book was called K.
Calumet K, yeah.
I feel like this is kind of a weird who's on first. Like, is the book called, what do we call the book? K. What? No, K. What's on second? Yeah, anyway.
Great read.
Yeah. I own a copy. I really need to get to it. If it's Ayn Rand's favorite book, I'll give it a chance. And then coming up at 8:30 UK time, it's James Valiant discussing the essay The Roots of War by Ayn Rand in the book Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. So we'll talk about relevance at the moment. Everybody check that out. All right, everybody. Thank you guys. Thank you both for joining us on the show. This was an insightful and interesting conversation relating to an otherwise very obviously sad and negative subject. So
thanks, Rucka. I appreciate it very much.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure to be here.
Yeah, mine too.
Cool. And looking forward to having you both back on soon. All right, everybody. See you back tomorrow for the Daily Objective, and goodbye.